We continue our series going through the book of Exodus. And what we've been saying is we are all caught up and we find ourselves in this really, really big story. And this story has been playing out for thousands and thousands of years. And God is the main actor in the story. And he is moving history the way he wants to move it to its pinnacle, to its climax. And what we see as God reveals himself to us is that it's not really about God's love for us. That is the essence of why we even exist and have meaning, yes. But as we look at how God treats us, he loves us, he reveals himself to us. The issue is not on God's side of the line, it's on our side of the line. It's about our love for him. Will we respond to who he is and what he's done? Deuteronomy 30, Moses says to the next generation of Israelites, all these commands are not far from you. All these commands of the Lord are near to you. God is near to you. Way later in Acts 17, Paul says that God has set everything up so that people might reach out or seek and find him. Although he's not playing hide and seek, he's near. He's not far from any of us. Our God, as we've been talking about, saves us from sin, from destruction, from enslavement, into something, from something, for something so much better, for his glory, for our transformation, for incredible things. We've been talking about true freedom and how true freedom is the ability to be everything that I was created to be. And so if God is my creator, I want to get to know him so I can be free. We've been talking about how we don't just need to be rescued from our external factors in our lives, like God rescued the Israelites so often. We also need to be rescued from ourselves and our sin. And so it gets tricky. And the question is, are we going to allow God to be God? Are we going to worship him the way that he wants to be worshiped and know him how he wants to be known? Knowing God is our greatest need. If we want to get to know ourselves, we should actually get to know God better. And today, we want to talk about this issue of perspective. Having perspective is an important quality to have to go through life. It is a sign of maturity to have perspective. As a Christian, it is essential to have perspective. And so here is us. This is our perspective. This is what we can see, right? And so I would say to you, from my own perspective, growing up, I had an obsessive personality. I thought obsessively. I made myself sick, and I couldn't sleep because I was so obsessed with certain deep thoughts and anxiety and depression. And then when I had a growth spurt, when I was about 12 years old, I developed scoliosis, which was significant, a 14-degree tilt toward the bottom of my back that caused a lot of physical pain. And from my perspective, that was limited. There was no place for any of that to land in any redemptive way. It just hurt. I was making myself sick. I was really kind of hopeless. I was kind of miserable. And so I either had to face that or I just drowned myself in busyness. That was my perspective at the time. Now, as we'll see, and as things will play out, God has a different perspective, not just on my life, but on all of our lives. He's higher than we are. He sees wider than we do, obviously, because he's God. And so even though we don't have access to this perspective really, we can know that God does. And as I'll share with you as we go, God's perspective has been so important in helping me in my perspective and in my life. So we're going to talk about perspective this morning. And perspective, this limited perspective that we have is fertile ground. It's fertile ground for trust to develop in God because we don't have his perspective, but also other things can develop, like anxiety if we don't trust that God has a perspective that we don't, and discouragement and just depression. And so how we handle that matters a ton. So we're going to be talking about, as Tori said, we're going to be talking about the Red Sea incident, which I could make an argument that this Red Sea incident, that before the cross of Jesus Christ, is the number one redemptive act in all of human history, or specifically of Israelite history. It's the number one most popular, most accessible, most talked about thing. Movies have been made about it. It's all over the Old Testament, not just in Exodus. It's all over the Psalms. And the Psalms keep saying, after the fact, remember, remember, remember the Red Sea. Remember it. So we'll get there. But where we left off, God did all of these plagues in Egypt to try to free his people, and he was successful because finally, after the plague of the firstborn, Pharaoh said, just go, get out, I don't want to see you anymore. And so they start to leave. Before they do, Moses, from God to Moses, commemorates this Passover and starts to talk to the Israelites about these feasts that were meant to commemorate whose they are and everything that God was doing in these moments, and consecrating the firstborn, where the Israelites would have children, and then their firstborn, they would offer them to God, and that before he offered them back. All these powerful things were being set up in these feasts to commemorate and remember. And Moses talked to the people about how they're going to go to the land of Canaan, the promised land. And then somehow Moses had Joseph's bones, which connect the Israelites to the past. Hundreds of years ago, Joseph died, and the promise was that Joseph's bones would be buried in the promised land. So the Israelites had these bones. They were connected to the past. And then they start walking. They start walking out of Egypt. And then we read this in Exodus 13, verses 17 and 18. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter, for God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert toward the Red Sea. And so right away, there's this conflict. There's this weird thing happening. From the Israelites' perspective, they're supposed to be going north on this like along the Mediterranean Sea toward the promised land, and God takes them on a different path. And the question is, will they trust him that he has the perspective they don't have? As you look at all of these journeys through Exodus, the journey is always just as important, if not more important, than the actual destination. And God is being merciful here because we see from God's perspective that God is trying to avoid them having to see the Philistines and going to war. Even though the narrator is telling us this, the people didn't understand this. Which makes us think, I think, about all of the what-ifs, of course, some of which we're not aware of, all the bad things that could have happened to us that didn't happen to us because God's providential and protective hand was on us. Sometimes we get glimpses of this. I had a conversation with Rob Urban this last week, and he was talking about how one of his coworkers was in a car right in front of him and got into this really serious accident. He got T-boned on Alpine, and luckily he is alive, and he's going to probably make close to a full recovery, but Rob was the next car. And then thinking about my wife's uncle, Mark, who worked for the Port Authority and for like 30 years and worked in the World Trade Center. And on 9/11, he was sick and he was the next train in. He would have been on time and he probably wouldn't be with us today. And so we sometimes get these glimpses of God's providence, but just to think about the concept of all the things that could have happened to us that didn't happen to us because God had a perspective and a power that we didn't, and he was moving things in a certain direction even though we may not have been aware of it. So I promise you I'm not going to nerd out on you, but I want you to look at a map for a minute. It's going to be a couple of different times. You don't need to read all the words on there or anything like that. I just want you to pay attention to the circle, because I believe from history and archaeology and geophysicism and all that stuff that this is probably where this was taking place. This spot, this Red Sea incident probably took place up above where you might see is the bigger part of the Red Sea. So these geophysicists did satellite imagery, and they had their boots on the ground, and they did all this kind of tests and stuff, and they saw these canals that connected these lakes to the Mediterranean Sea, to each other, and to the Red Sea in the 1970s. They were clear to see on satellite imagery. And so if they crossed the Red Sea, it didn't have to happen at the bottom there in the big part. It could have happened up top at one of the canals or the channels or the lakes that technically was part of the Red Sea. There's some confusion because if you read Exodus 14 and 15 and Numbers 33, it's like they crossed the sea and then they camped near the sea and what was going on. I think that's actually what was going on. So all of these canals and these lakes up near the circle where you see, they created a natural border on the east side of Egypt. One of the towns that's going to be mentioned in a minute is called the Mouth of the Canals. And so I believe the Israelites ran into a problem right away. There was a barrier right away that they had to deal with. Exodus 13, verses 21 and 22. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. This is some sort of weird manifestation or theophany, this God's presence somehow. I'm not sure exactly what they saw. I want to believe they saw a pillar of cloud or a pillar of fire, right? Just kind of what the text tells us. I don't know exactly what it looked like. It mentions an angel in other places, and so we're not exactly sure, but here's the point. When God asks us to go somewhere, He doesn't just stay away and have us go by ourselves. He goes with us. When He asked the Israelites to go on this journey, and even though they were confused from their perspective, certainly at times, He is with them. He doesn't ask them to go anywhere that He isn't willing to go Himself. And so He asks, He sends, but He joins us. You might think that this would come in handy today, this pillar of cloud or fire. You might say, gosh, that would help me. I wouldn't even have to really pray and really trust that much because the pillar would be there, and then if the pillar moved, I would just move with it, and then if the pillar stayed, I would just stay right where I was. Hey, Ben, can you come out and play? I don't know. Ask the pillar. It's right there. It's not moving. There's this cloud. It's just hovering. I have to stay where it is. I can't come play unless the cloud moves with me. I can't move in this direction for a career until the cloud moves with me. I think it could be incredibly frustrating to have this cloud or fire. I think it would be really cool, but I think it would stay there, and I'd want to go, and it would be, no, stay. And there were times where I'd want to stay, and it would be like, it's time to move, and I don't want to. And you're going to see that with the Israelites, that it was still incredibly, incredibly frustrating. They still had to surrender and choose to trust God just like we do. First part of chapter 14, we read this. Then the Lord said to Moses, tell the Israelites to turn back and camp near Pi-hahiroth between Migdol and the sea. They are about to camp by the sea directly opposite Baal-Zephon. So you get these towns that are mentioned here. Again, I think this is happening in the northwest corner that I showed you on the map. And so what you have to understand is this is a bad strategy. This is God getting the Israelites stuck between a rock and a hard place. It doesn't make any sense as He moves them south instead of north, right, away from the promised land. And then He's kind of like, nope, I want you to tail back and start going north again and camp by, again, the Red Sea. So if you look at the map, and you keep it within that circle, which is where I want us to focus on, they start going down, and then God's like, no, I want you to kind of go back up. And it really, from their perspective, it doesn't make any sense. Verses 3 through 4. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he'll pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. Do you see the perspective differences? So this is God's plan. And if you read on in Exodus 14, Pharaoh does find out from probably a messenger that the Israelites are wandering around seemingly aimlessly in the desert, and he changes his heart, where he's like, I want to get them back. Look at all of the servants that we lost. And so he starts to go after them. Now keep in mind, God has already done the 10 plagues in Egypt. God has made His presence very, very clearly known and His power established. And it's God being patient as He is dissecting these other gods and establishing Himself as the one true God These gods and goddesses in this culture had this reputation for being temperamental, where they could turn on people at the drop of a hat. So possibly Pharaoh was thinking maybe Israel's God was turning on them in the desert. And so this is right where we want them. Now, it talks about how Pharaoh had all of these chariots, like 600 plus with these officers. He's getting his best people together to go out and get the Israelites. And so again, keep this perspective in mind. From the Israelites' perspective, they were kind of sitting ducks. They were trapped. They were hemmed in. It didn't make any sense. It was a bad traveling and military strategy. But again, the narrator is giving us God's perspective. God has a plan that the people couldn't see or didn't understand. And God is saying, one of the results of this is, I'm going to gain glory through myself, for myself. I'm going to gain glory. And so this is where I want to pause, and I just want to say that God acts for the sake of His name. He acts for the sake of His name rather in response to what we do or do not merit. Thank God for that. Thank God that He is jealous for His name, and He doesn't just treat me on the basis of my heart, my response, my ability to trust, my sinful heart, my ability to want to just go in the direction I want to go. He acts for the sake of His name. If I act just for the sake of my name, I'm selfish. If God wants glory, He is not selfish because He is God. And so we're very thankful that God acts for the sake of glorifying His name, because He is good. And anytime He glorifies His name, that is good. And we can trust Him with that. And that He doesn't treat us based on what we deserve or what we merit. Because if we did, or if He did, we'd all be in a whole lot of trouble. Verses 8 and verses 10, I just want to show you this contrast here. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. His heart was already really hard. God hardened it further. And so that he pursued the Israelites, who were marching out boldly. Yeah, look what we've done. Yeah, mess with us again. Egyptians, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. Uh-oh. Most powerful nation in the world. We're kind of hemmed in. We're sitting ducks. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They went from boldness to being terrified because they were operating from their own perspective on their own strength, and they weren't trusting enough in God. Easy to say, right? Because they were in a difficult spot. Verses 11 through 12. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out to Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Do you see what's happening? From their perspective, they are trapped. The pillar of cloud and fire is staying right there. It's not moving, and they are terrified. They're scared. And so they start to reinterpret their past. You know, slavery wasn't so bad. We were fed. We had shelter. It was awful, by the way, but no, they're reinterpreting it as it was better. We told you we didn't want to come out here. God hasn't helped us. He didn't help us in over 400 years. And so this kind of highlights their unbelief and their lack of trust. We told you it would have been better to stay there. We told you we didn't want to go. And keep this in mind, because this theme is going to come back over and over again. In fact, the psalmist says in Psalm 106:7 that the Israelites didn't remember God's kindnesses that were done to them over and over and over again. You might be sitting here thinking, if I saw those plagues, even one of those plagues, I would never, ever doubt God again. But I don't think that's how the human heart works. I really don't. Because at the first sign of trouble, the Israelites start to doubt and complain and grumble, and it's going to be a theme that keeps coming up. And remember this theme that Exodus is forcing us to deal with. We can be enslaved and be free at the same time. Be truly free. Or we can be free outwardly, but be enslaved. And so there's more going on than what we can see. This is where we'll say it this way. God places us in difficult situations to reveal his glory and so that we'll learn to rely on him. If you're a new Christian, I want you to try to just get used to that. If you've been a Christian a long time, you understand this. You may not like it still. We may not like it, but this is who our God is. He places us in difficult situations to reveal his glory and so that we will learn to rely on him. Oftentimes in our lives, things get worse before they get better. That's life in this broken world. It's the work that God is doing in the midst of a broken world, in the midst of our broken hearts. He is doing this. He's placing us in difficult situations to reveal his glory. It's about his name so that we will learn to also rely on him. Exodus 14, verses 13 and 14, and a little beyond. Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid." Yeah, easier said than done, Moses. "Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." Interesting. "The Lord will fight for you." Our God is fighting for us always. You need only to be still. You need only to be still. It's interesting because God is talking like he's talking to the patriarchs before these people. He's talking to his people that way, which was validating. You think of Ephesians 6, where Paul's talking about putting on the armor of God, standing firm so that you can withstand the attack from the evil one. This is our idea of the victory and the battle, in a sense, has already been won. And because it's already been won, I need you to stand firm and just hold tight to that shield. Because the shield's going to work for you. You just need to stand firm. You need to stay put. You don't necessarily have to fight back, although Ephesians 6 does say we have the sword of the Spirit. That is our weapon, of course. But in this context, just stand firm and be still. It's hard for us. It's hard to stand firm. It's hard to stay. It's hard to wait. We want to fight back when people hurt us. We want to move. We want to be doing something, and that's not the message here. Psalm 23 comes to my mind, where God prepares a table for us in the presence of our enemies. I raise a hallelujah because I never have any problems. No, that's not why we raise a hallelujah. It's not because of a lack of problems. It's because of the presence of God in the midst of our troubles. That's why we raise a hallelujah. In the presence of my enemies, not because the enemies are there. That's terrible. I don't like enemies. That's awful. That's scary. I'm anxious even thinking about that. I raise it because God is with me. It's not my absence of problems. It's the presence of God. And that takes a seasoned faith and a certain posture that some of us just don't have. The Israelites certainly didn't have it. And God is saying again, through Moses, I'm going to do the heavy lifting. But then he says, now it's time to move. Why are you crying out to me? I think this is God speaking to Moses to speak to the Israelites. I don't think that he's going to Moses like, what are you crying for, big baby? It's time to move. I don't think he's doing that. Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. So there's a time to stay, and then there's a time to move. Think about their perspective, though. Move where? Move toward the Egyptian army, the most powerful army in the world? They weren't equipped for battle. Move into the water? Maybe now. Maybe we're getting somewhere. Move where? They can't wiggle out. They're desperate. They're hopeless. They're afraid. And it's perfect. It's the perfect temperature because God's about to do something amazing. And he's saying to Moses now, you're going to raise your staff. You're going to stretch out your arm over the water. And the waters are going to somehow oddly divide, and then you're going to walk in the middle of it, and it just sounds funny, right? And I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart more, as if I haven't done it enough already, and then they're going to chase after you, and then I'm going to get a lot of glory. Oh yeah, God, sign me up for that, right? Okay, verses 19 and 20. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. I know who goes before me, who leads me. I know who stands behind. The God of angel armies is always by my side. Come on, like it's almost like we do this intentionally, right? Angel, pillar, both. We're not exactly sure, but we are sure that it's God's presence, and he stands between. There is something huge. They're seeing part of this, but there's something huge going on that they can't see or understand. The same God who is guiding them has now chosen to leave his post of guidance and now has gone to the rear part and now is guarding them. He is standing between this army that can destroy them and his people. It's powerful. Does that make anybody else think of the cross? Jesus as the mediator between who? Between God and us. And thank God that he's our mediator, because we sure do need him. He guides, he guards. The text says this happens throughout the whole night. A lot of this is playing out at night. So if you've seen movies and it's playing out, most of it's during the daytime, most of this event happened at night. Verses 21 and 22. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back, so this didn't happen in 2 seconds, with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their left and on their right. From this perspective, I don't know what I'm looking at. It's incredible. I'm certainly not wanting to walk into it. I can admire it, like, whoa, that's cool. Oh, no, you're going to walk through it. No, thanks. Actually, if I was one of the million Israelites and I was toward the back, I'd be like, this is going to be good because I'm going to see what happens to the other 900,000 first. Oh, that didn't work out so well. Yeah, I think I'm going to stay right here, right back here. So again, perspective becomes important, but there's even more going on, because what you realize, especially in Hebrew, is that God is doing something even bigger. This is an act of creation. He's using Genesis 1 language. He's separating the waters. He's creating order where there is chaos. God created us. We sinned. He destroyed, whether it was regional or earthly, the world through a flood. And then he remade a group of people through Noah. He remade his world. And here it's happening all over again. He is making a new people for himself. This water symbolizes chaos and judgment. And we see God taming the waters like it's nothing for him. Does that make anybody else think of Jesus on the Sea of Galilee, where he calms the storm? And I don't know if some of you are hung up on if you're new believers or you're not a believer or whatever. I'm so glad that you're here and that you're listening or watching. But here's the point. If there is a God, it's nothing for him to suspend nature and to manipulate nature to suit his purposes. If there actually is a God, it's nothing for him to tame nature. Nothing. So I just want that to be the takeaway for this morning. So Egypt is so dominant. On paper, they would just have their way with the Israelites. They would absolutely destroy them. They had all of the weaponry. And yet we notice that God is going to use their strength against them. And so the Israelites start to walk, and the Egyptians pursue. And now it's getting early in the morning as they are crossing this lake, which is definitely part of the Red Sea for sure. Early in the morning, the text says that God threw the Egyptians into more confusion. So I don't know if their chariot wheels started falling off. You get some of that depiction in the movies. It locked up their chariot wheels, maybe, and just threw them into confusion. And then somebody says from the Egyptian side in verse 25, let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against us. Yeah, except it's kind of too late, right? It's too late. Or maybe is it too late? I don't know, because God is revealing himself not just to the Israelites, but to the Egyptians. And what was necessary if you were in Pharaoh's army and you had this realization right before you died that, oh wow, God really is Lord? And what if God, in his grace and his mercy, decided to save a person because they realized before they died, right before the waters collapsed over them, that God really is the Lord, that Israel's God, that Yahweh really is God? I think that's certainly possible. Verses 26 through 28. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians." Now we get a reversal, right? "And their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back in its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived, except for one who was as good of a swimmer as Michael Phelps. He swam his way out. No, he didn't. None of them survived. None of them survived. This is a reversal. God is taming the sea and separating the water so the Israelites could walk through on dry ground. But now he's bringing judgment. So now it's the reversal. It's the chaos as the sea collapses over Israel's enemies. And in one moment, even though their perspective was limited, I think everything made sense. I think everything made sense in that moment, that this was all God. This was all God's doing, that he hardened hearts that were already hard, by the way. He threw the Egyptians into confusion and panic. He threw them into the sea. The same seas that they walked in the middle of collapsed over them. Egypt was so dominant, he's using their strength against them. And this is where we have to pause and say, even if you don't believe in God, you're going to be used by him because he's God. You're going to be part of his story. Joseph's brothers tried to use it all for evil, and God turned it on its head and used the same evil intentions for good. That's who our God is. That's what our God does. I don't know about you, but I want to be on his side. I don't want to work against a being like that. I don't want it to be too late where I'm like, the waters are collapsing, and I'm like, oh yeah, those plagues should have been a really good hint. But yeah, I was wrong. I was following orders, right? I don't want to be in that situation if I can help it. Sin is irrational. It happens when we take our perspective and demand that we have God's perspective, or pretend that we have his perspective, or try to pretend that God doesn't have that perspective, and we live however we want to live. It happens when we don't trust God. It happens when we believe God doesn't have a perspective. He doesn't care. He doesn't have our best interests in mind. Maybe he's not able to accomplish stuff. That's a situation that's ripe for sin to happen. It's when we don't trust. We see this God that is making distinctions between Israel and Egypt. He's not doing it because Egypt is really bad and Israel is really good. You're going to see next week that Israel is not good at all. Their hearts are really gross and wicked, just like ours. But he's making distinctions, and I hope that makes you also, again, think of the cross, where God makes the ultimate distinctions through Jesus. You either have him or you don't. I've been divorced. I killed somebody. I went to jail. I don't care. It's who Jesus is. You have him or you don't have him. It is kind of beautifully simple that way. One more piece to this destruction. I don't know if the Israelites were aware of this. Later on they would have been, but the Egyptian god Ra, the sun god, they said that he died at night and he rose in the morning to protect the Egyptians. When is this act of judgment, the Red Sea, playing out? In the morning, as the sun is rising. God is again claiming victory over the Egyptian gods. And Pharaoh and the Egyptians, they practiced chaos and uncreation. They enslaved a group of people. They drowned the Israelite baby boys. And so God judged them by that same standard. We'll say it this way. We don't need God's perspective. We don't need it. We just need to trust that God has a perspective that we don't. And we need to trust him. we don't need God's perspective. We don't have God's perspective. We just need to trust that God has a perspective that we don't have. I was talking back and forth this whole weekend with my friend Sarah Spittler, and most of you know Sarah, and she is trying intentionally to take something terrible. Her husband and then ex-husband, Eric, took his own life in January. And she is wanting, like God, to bring beauty and meaning out of something so broken. She wants to bring awareness to this issue of suicide. She wants to bring wellness. She wants there to be healing and all of these things. And she's setting these events up for on behalf of Eric and behalf of all that. And so she's doing this 5K walk or run. She canceled it once because of Michigan weather. And then she had to cancel it again this weekend because of Michigan weather, which stinks. She was frustrated. I think I was more frustrated than she was. You know what she said to me? God's timing, not ours. God's timing, not ours. I don't have that perspective. I don't have it. But I'm trusting in God's timing, not my own. And so when we do have this thing on behalf of Eric, it's going to have maximum impact. You know why? God's timing, not ours. Can I give you one snapshot of what God, and many of you know this, but what God has done in my life as I have realized, if I have gotten glimpses into this perspective, all of my pain, all of my anxiety, my depression, my anger, my obsessive thinking, my chronic pain physically, the scoliosis and everything that comes with that, God has made me into a much better person, a more loving pastor and counselor and husband and friend, not because I've gained God's perspective, because I haven't, but because I've just chose to lean in and trusted and said, God, I believe that you don't waste pain. I believe that you're not going to waste this. And just leaning in, can I just tell you how much incredible meaning and value that I've gotten from that? The fact that I have watched and experienced God take something that's so broken in my life and so hopeless in my own perspective and limited ability and turn it into something incredibly beautiful that can be used to nourish my own faith, but also to maybe help a little bit nourish yours. God is incredible. He doesn't waste an ounce of pain. How about you? How about you? Some of you are sitting in this right now, like Sarah. It's still undone, right? You don't know what God's going to do in this particular season of life, but I would just recommend that you look back at what God's done before in your life, or that you get around other believers that have lived this longer and can share with you and can encourage you as you go to maybe stand firm and to stay and to trust. Verses 29 and 31 as we get close to wrapping up here. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. You see the shift in fear? They were afraid of the Egyptian army, and now they're afraid of God. And that's exactly the shift that we all need to make. From whatever we're afraid of to God. Because when we fear God, everything else falls into place. The Israelites were given a glimpse of God's power, and they were able to see in this moment. We look at our world, our life, we wonder where God is. We are geared not to trust. So Ben, how do I learn to trust God more? I'll tell you how. Fast forward centuries, on the cross, and at the cross, the walls of our sin, the waters of our sin that were walled up, collapsed not onto us, they collapsed onto Jesus. He was forsaken, things got really dark, the waters of judgment collapsed onto him so that we could walk on dry ground. When everything seemed hopeless from the disciples' perspectives, God was accomplishing his best work on the cross. And what makes you think that that kind of God isn't doing the exact same thing in your life right here and now? or isn't capable. He's the same God. 3 days later, God raised Jesus from the dead. There was this ultimate reversal. Paul calls Jesus the first fruits of the resurrection, which means because Jesus was raised from the dead, we can know, we don't have to guess that if we have faith in Christ, we can know that we're going to be raised from the dead. We can know that God's going to protect us through death into new life. As the people, the Israelites, stood on the shore, gazing on the power and wonder of what God had done, as the Egyptians kind of came into the shore dead, we should gaze and fix our attention on the cross and be captivated by the beauty, right? Fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Last slide, Romans 5, 8, and 9, Paul says, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we now have been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? While we were still rebelling, it had nothing to do with us. If it was about us, we're in trouble. It has everything to do with Jesus. It's what he's done for us. He's inviting us into this trust and this journey of faith, not to have his perspective, but to trust that he does have a perspective. Let us together fix our eyes on Jesus and be captivated by his beauty. Let's fix our eyes on the cross and the empty tomb. You know why? That's way better than a cloud.